After all the presentations, there'll be time to answer questions and debate. I will now hand over to the chair of the event, Dr. Stephen Hinks from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, who will introduce the first speaker of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this Grantham Centre Festival of Debate event. As Danielle said, my name is Stephen Hinks. I'm based in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at Sheffield. We're obviously aware of the challenges we face in decarbonising our cities globally, as evidence has shown that denser cities and a reduction in urban sprawl can lead to positive impacts on carbon emissions, leading to more efficient use of infrastructure, a reduction in private car use, and so on and so forth. But questions remain over the wider implications of increasing urban density on quality of life, on social sustainability, and the politics of placemaking globally. And so in today's event, as Danielle mentioned, we've got 3 speakers who come from a range of backgrounds and sectors, who will address the provocative and obviously extremely timely question of whether urban densification is the future of our cities. And so the first speaker today, Guilherme Rodrigues, is from the Centre for Cities, and Guilherme joined the centre as a researcher in January 2021 and holds a BSc and MSc in economics from Nova School of Business and Economics in Lisbon. Guilherme is an analyst at the Centre for Cities, where he focuses on transport, exploring how different urban forms shape mobility and carbon emissions. And his main publication on that front is measuring up, comparing public transport in the UK and Europe's biggest cities. So I'll hand over to Guilherme to begin. We have 15 minutes thereabout, and then, as Danielle said, we'll take questions at the end of the session where we bring together the debate across the 3 speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm Guilherme, analyst at Centre for Cities. We are a think tank that studies the economies of the British cities and largest towns. And today my presentation will be focused on connectivity and the role of density in Britain. So to start with, as we all know, connectivity is very important for at the individual level and at the city and the national level, connecting people to their jobs, to their services, to friends, to do activities. And we do know that the UK is very congested in terms of car, even if we ignore net zero for a second, for the European context. So London is the most congested city in Europe, and according to TomTom, top 50 most congested cities in Europe, 10 are in the UK, 7 in Germany, 3 in France, and 5 in Italy. So we can see that a lot of our largest cities, like Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, are quite congested. So one way to improve these outcomes is naturally improving public transport outcomes and active travel, walking and cycling to mitigate this. And currently, with the exception of London, we know from some analysis we've done in the Centre for Cities that British cities, in terms of public transport connectivity, they underperform similar sized cities in the continent. And this has both environmental problems, but also economic ones. So we can see here in this figure, we have 2 groups. It's the same cities. The more yellow dots are the total population of cities in the UK and in Western Europe, and it has a positive relationship with productivity, as we know.
Sorry, Guilherme, we can't see the slides. I mean, I hope it's not just me.
No.
Yeah, it's not visible.
So if you just go, Guilherme, if you just go to present now, at the bottom, the square with the arrow in, the square with the arrow in.
Now let me. Can you see them now?
Still not, but it might take a while. Just a sec. No, it doesn't look like anything is happening. It worked before when we tested it. I'm not sure why. Are you trying to present a window?
Yes.
Hmm.
Window.
No, we still can't see anything.
It says on my side it's sharing.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Can you try to close it and try it again, please?
Try it again.
Yeah, maybe try to, sorry everyone, maybe try to leave the meeting and come back again. Maybe that's
Sure.
going to help. Sorry. Hi, Guilherme. Can you try again? You should be able to share now.
Trying. It says it's sharing on my side. Do you see anything?
No, we can't. It's so strange because it shows that you're presenting, but it doesn't seem to be doing it. Can you maybe send your slides to me?
I
And
have
then
the slides. I
you have
might
the
be able
slide.
to
Oh,
share.
great.
Yeah.
Danielle, can you try it, please? Sorry.
Is that working?
Yeah, that's working. Yay.
Cool.
Sorry
Just tell me
all
when
the-
to go next.
Yes, so another slide, 2 more slides, I think. Next one. Yeah, the one before, sorry. So we can see over here, when we look at British cities and European cities by size, the yellow dots, there's a positive relationship between size and productivity. But the green ones, it's actually the size of the population that can reach the city center in 30 minutes. So it's transportation adjusted size. The relationship is larger. And you can see that Manchester on the bottom is as large as Rome in total number of population, GM, but when we adjust for public transport outcomes, it's much more closer to Dortmund, a much smaller city, than to Rome. So we know there's something going on public transport. British cities are highly congested, and part of it, we believe it is something to do with the network itself, but also about the density profile in the UK. So in the next slide, I've picked Sheffield and Lille in France, relatively similar sized cities. Here I'm using the primary urban area or definition, so it includes Rotherham as well. So, and when we see how many people can reach the city center by public transport in both areas, in both cities, Lille can do it 3 times more people, almost 500,000 people, and the area covered, it's much larger, it's 3 times larger. So public transport connectivity it's better. It seems to be the size of the network when you see at first sight. But more interestingly is that if you would replicate the extension of Leeds public transport network to Sheffield, next slide, you could not fully close the gap. So in Lille, 46% of people can reach the city center in 30 minutes, and under these estimates, it's saying only 16% in Sheffield. From the remaining gap, just by improving the network alone, we would close 2/3 It's a lot of it, but it wouldn't do the overall job. Part of it is because not only the core parts of Sheffield city center, but the outskirts as well, they are not as dense. So if we build more infrastructure, we won't have as many users or potential users than in a city like Lille with a similar size and not that different from Sheffield historically. So next slide, please. And this doesn't mean like high-rise towers. A lot of times when we speak about density, people have a perception. So on the left, we can see a picture of Spring Lane around Sheffield Supertram, roughly 15 minutes from city center. And on the other side, we can see a street in Lille. Of course, these are just two pictures. That does not fully represent it, but you can see that the urban form is slightly different, but we don't see major towers. It's most about mid-rise, not so much having distance between one building next to the other. This is not only about Sheffield. So next slide, please. If we measure the share of residents that live in square kilometers with more than 1,000 residents, so this is a proxy for, let's say, higher density. Sheffield and a lot of cities in the UK are on the right, so less than 10% of their residents live in relatively dense environments. There are some exceptions, of course, London, Brighton, Edinburgh does quite well. There's a lot of change within European cities. We know that Spanish and Italian cities tend to be denser than others, but broadly speaking, we can see that somewhere between 15 to 30% of these cities have residents living in relatively dense environments that we do not often observe in British ones. Next slide, please. And naturally, part of it has to do where people live. So we know that the percentage of people living in flats in the UK is fairly small. It's around 15%. Other places in the continent, it's closer to 20, 30%. And then we have the more extreme cases, Italy and Spain, Germany, which is much higher. So we have this detached housing model of urbanization that is partially the reason for the outcomes we have on the public transport side, and also necessarily on the private and the public. Sorry. Next slide. And this naturally has carbon implications. So this on the left, you can see this very popular example of comparing Atlanta and Barcelona, similar population, almost 6 times more carbon emissions in Atlanta than Barcelona, in a much more compact and urban form. We know that British cities are not like Atlanta, but this dynamic about sprawliness expect them to have higher carbon emissions. And then we also know that the domestic emissions from not taking into consideration transport, just eating, energy efficient, so on and so forth, the kind of detached houses and semi-detached houses that we have in the UK tend to emit more carbon. A lot of it has to do that the British housing stock, it's the oldest one in Europe, but this combination about densifying, have better buildings and more efficient, tell us that there are some improvements in the way we can reach net zero looking at cities. Next slide. So this is just a proxy of the 63 cities that we do. We analyze how much is their transport emissions per capita, and then proxy for density, how many people are living in areas with 6K or more per square kilometer. And you can see it's not straightforward, but you see a relationship. Places like Brighton and London, transport-related emissions are much lower. They tend to be denser. Places like Milton Keynes and Preston, we know that they came from these waves of new towns. They were built more around the car. They are not so dense, more sprawly, and carbon emissions are related to transport almost twice as high as these two cities that I've said. Next slide, please. So this is photos. We know Barcelona superblocks, very popular in the media and in some circles of the debate. Now 15-minute cities, and the other city on the right It's Pontevedra in the north of Spain, a city that gets rid of cars in its city center. All these ideas in praxis and theory, what they tend to have in common is that they require relatively high levels of density. So shops and services have enough customers around to service them. And also we have density that makes public transport much more viable to these models to work and even active travel. Next slide. So we know that changing the urban form, it's difficult. So we will not have cities like Spain overnight, or maybe we don't even desire that. So we should prioritize new infrastructure around new infrastructure. For example, expanding trams, metros. For example, if there's an expansion of Metrolink, densifying those areas should be a prioritization. Also densifying areas in city centers that are already relatively well connected. Lille, the city that I've presented, has used, for example, minimum density requirements around rail stations that they developed in the past. That's a tool. Changing the planning requirements around these areas could be another way. And the densification can be seen also as a way of making this infrastructure financially viable. So you have more clients, potential clients. There'll probably be more revenue from ticketing, and also on the financing side of it. And we have seen it around the world, some public transport investments that finance themselves partially. Hong Kong is the extreme example, but partially finance themselves by developing and densifying areas around the stations by selling the land and the apartments. And that's all for me for now. And sorry for the technical problems.
Thanks, Guilherme. Thank you for that really insightful presentation. We'll move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Suyash Mankame from Suyash Mankame Design Studio in Mumbai in India, who also teaches at the AIKTC School of Architecture. And Suyash has been practicing as an architect for a decade and now owns his own design studio, at which he's principal architect. He's also been teaching for the past 7 years as part of as a member of the visiting faculty at the School of Architecture. So he's from one of the densest cities in the world, Mumbai, and is interested in urban form and design solutions as part of Mumbai's complex, vibrant and dynamic cityscape. So it's great to be able to hear from Suyash, who has the practice and academic interface to draw on. So I'll hand over to Suyash to present the next slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen. Thank you, Abhishek, for inviting me and giving this opportunity where I can come and present my work. So thank you so much. Is the screen visible?
Yeah, it's coming there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you again. Today I'll be talking about the overall.
Really sorry to interrupt you. If you could just present the slide, present itself.
I am sharing.
It's being shared right now, but it's not being presented. Yeah, perfect.
Now it's you need to just enable it to go full screen. So right now we can see all the slides and the notes.
Okay. I have done that.
So if you go to slideshow.
Yes, I am. Okay, I can just hide this. You still see the same?
We can't see the notes now, but we still see kind of the slides on the left.
How about now?
Still the same, but I mean, I guess it doesn't matter. We still see the main slide.
Okay, so shall I go on?
Yeah,
Because
I think that's fine.
On my screen, it's on my screen, it's showing the entire screen particularly.
That looks fine to me.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of history, development of Mumbai particularly, and along with Mumbai, I'm also going to speak about Navi Mumbai per se. So I'll be talking about development with respect to housing and infrastructure, and factors affecting it, and the impact of all this development on the urban fabric, and the issue of densification, how it is tackled in formal and informal, I mean planned and unplanned manner. So just to understand a little history of Mumbai, Mumbai is an island city. It's a financial capital of India. Earlier, it used to be 7 islands, which were kind of given to Britishers by Portuguese as a dowry in 1661, and the land was later reclaimed by Britishers. If you see, the development pattern of Mumbai is completely linear, where it's not happening in a centric way. It just happens in an axis of north to south. So development has been happening since almost 200, 300 years, and the city has kind of reached its all the limits where uh, you cannot create land. If you want to do any kind of development, it has to be by reclaiming the land, and it's not possible anymore. So any kind of development intervention that you would be doing is going to be kind of a retrofit intervention, and it's going to be on fire.
Sorry, Suyash. We can't
Yep.
see we can't see the other slides. It's still stuck. Yeah, now we can see the second one. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
So do you see the third one now?
We see the
Now?
yes, we can see the third one now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So okay, I'll just present it like this. Okay. So Mumbai has been going through these lot of changes, and it had reached its limit where the city kind of is having something like this as a built form and built fabric, where people come to cities and they migrate to cities in search of job and houses, where dense cities, as we consider, are the engines of global economy. And due to this, there's a lot of inward migration which is happening, and that is putting a lot of pressure on the existing infrastructure. And that is not actually happening in a very sustainable way, because people are just building over and over again, which is not at all working on a ground reality. So cities struggling to provide basic housing, transport, and infrastructure. It is basically, it's difficult to practice the model of live where you work. So the sustainable model that we talk about, it's absolutely difficult because of the land, the cost, and the approach of development that has been happening in cities. So what is happening is people are kind of moving away from the city centers, and they are looking to stay in suburbs and new towns of development. So, because of the high density and high land values, the high construction cost, the cost of living is kind of totally unaffordable. And due to this, there are a lot of socio-political, geographical factors also, which are kind of making it very unaffordable kind of living conditions. And that's why the suburbs are also getting completely filled. And people have started to move to fringes. So, if you can see, this is what the city looks like. I mean, the low rise, high dense areas, the high rise, mid and high dense areas. If you see, this is a kind of development pattern the city has been going under, and the red marks are the all the built fabrics that are there. I mean, it's just completely saturated. As we say, the local trains, the transport is kind of considered to be the main lifeline of Mumbai, but you'll be surprised to know 7 million people travel through local trains daily. And this is a kind of scenario happening every day and night at peak office hours, where it is working, but it is not working in a way people are happy about it. So Mumbai's population has reached 2.1 crore, that's 21 million. I mean, it is one of the most highly dense or densely populated cities in the world, where we're talking about 73,000 people per square mile. And this is the current scenario. So after all this, I mean, there was a need for another kind of place or another city which would kind of give similar economic commercial opportunities. So due to the land and due to the geographical conditions of the city, it can't get extended anywhere. A new city was proposed in 1970, which is the Navi Mumbai. The eastward development was proposed to the main island city, and the idea was to have same economic, commercial, and residential opportunities. So the current scenario is it is kind of working in a way it was designed. So it was planned in a sustainable aspect. I'm just going to explain that quickly. So while the project was getting conceptualized, one thing that we need to understand that there were 95 villages which used to exist at that time, and the new development was kind of happening around these towns, and the entire idea was to decongest Mumbai to reduce the densities from Mumbai and shift to a new place. So SIDCO was a development authority who was taking care of the project, and the existing population of this thing currently was zero point 0.1 million. Now, if you see the development of November, it is kind of a polycentric development which is planned where each node has been planned as a separate entity which would provide same economical, commercial and industrial opportunities. It is planned as a self-sufficient, self-sustaining model where people would stay where they will work, so to reduce the carbon footprint. And I think it is kind of working somehow in a majority of the way, where the development or the design strategies which were used is kind of coming to a ground reality. Uh, Predominantly, it is planned as a residential zone or residential area. The development was again on a self-financial level. It is very interesting to understand the development of Navi Mumbai, how it happened. So, if you say the main connection with the island city was established, all the nodes, 14 nodes, were planned along the central axis, and the central business district was planned in the center. Now, this is something that I want to highlight. I mean, this is a planning strategy which was used in 70s, where every city would have one commercial center and the residential development would happen around it. But somewhere, I think this concept has changed and people have sort of rejected the idea, and they are kind of they are looking for a mixed use real development where they'll stay and they'll really work, because as you are kind of seeing that the main city is kind of completely saturated and it has no place where people can stay. So all the fringes and all the suburbs are getting filled from where people have to travel and commute on a daily basis. The industrial development was also planned along the main central corridor on the other side. Uh, the port trust, the JNPT port trust, was also established due to its connection with the main island city and connection with the sea. There were four economic zones, SEZs, which were planned. And when you kind of overlap all these layers together and juxtapose them together, you kind of have a very holistic map of Navi Mumbai, which works fantastically on ground reality as well. But there was something interesting happening while this development was happening. We are also talking about the new international airport to again decongest Mumbai, which is again designed by Hadi, the architects. And there are kind of, it claims that it's going to provide almost 1.42 lakh job directly and 2 lakh job opportunities indirectly. So we are again talking about a lot of migration, a lot of people coming and staying here. So the aspect of affordable housing, the commute, which has to be cheaper, sustainable, all these factors are something which are going to be very important in the coming future. I want to talk about one article which talks about urban development and densification pattern of cities and urban villages. So it talks about the entire development of a new place, the way it happens, and what are the stages in which the city undergoes through. So initially, if you see, there are these small villages which are surrounded by these agricultural patches, and they're connected with small kachara roads. Now, builder or developer buys their lands, and these people lose their occupation, and they have to kind of shift to a new occupation. The development starts happening. The article says that the development happens after every 10 years. So the stages of transformation are happening after every decade. The first stage is where you have these small mid-rise, low-rise, mid-density structures which are coming around. And the one thing that we need to understand, that government or the authorities did not intervene in these villages. So their development was completely neglected. They were just provided with basic amenities like water supply and electricity, and there were no guidelines which were given to for their development, their growth. Their densities were not considered into picture at all. So after a decade, again, the second stage of transformation happens where the city is half. I mean, it is half occupied, and there are these new migrants who come there. And if you see, these villages are the people who kind of are the service providers, because most of the maids, security guards, auto drivers, bus drivers, and people who work in the city as blue collar jobs, they are the ones who are actually staying there, and they work in the very nearby areas. So they follow a very highly sustainable model where people who are living in these developed areas, they are kind of moving away for work. the aspect of affordability is something that is very important and interesting for us to understand. The final stage of transformation is where the entire thing is developed, and these Gauthans or urban villages are also completely developed because of the lack of development guidelines. They kind of develop their houses vertically, horizontally in all possible directions, which kind of puts again a pressure on the existing infrastructure. And the final stage of transformation is basically gentrification. If you see, there's a lot of interesting give and take relationship which happens between these formal and informal densities, because they have to be interdependent on each other for all a lot of household help, affordable cheap housing, markets, then jobs, entertainment, healthcare, education, transports, etc. Now, if you see, this is the kind of built fabric that we have. It's high rise, high density, mid rise, mid density, and low rise, mid density kind of a development. Now, by hinging on the aspect of gentrification, this is something that is very evidently seen, and there are two types of gentrifications which are currently happening. One is densified gentrification, and the other one is gentrified densification. I'll come to that. So, if you see this image, the red one which is highlighted is kind of the existing urban village, and the rest is the newly developed city. So, if you see, the urban village is completely mid-rise, high-density area where they kind of really struggle with basic amenities like light and ventilation also, and access roads, everything. So this is happening because land ownership is given to everyone to decide and give right to development. So any area that might have evolved organically will have densified gentrification as development happens through consent or personal interest. Now, densified gentrification has also been occurring in a lot of parts in Mumbai, particularly areas where government has initiated slum rehabilitation centers, slum rehabilitation projects, and these projects kind of aim to provide affordable, cheap housing to the residents, but of informal settlements. But they kind of often been criticized for lack of community engagement, the social sustainability aspects, and displacement, which happens where people have to kind of shift to a new location. In some cases, projects have also been accused of benefiting developers more than residents. So they due to the government policies of tax relaxation and everything. Second, this is the existing picture of the same downtown, so you can see and imagine what kind of urban fabric that we have, what kind of urban life that we are imagining talking about. The other one is gentrified densification, where it completely opposite, where it's an opportunist or capitalist model of development, where private big giants like Godrej, Lodhas, and private developers, they kind of identify these big, large land parcels at the fringes of the cities, and densification happens, but at extreme suburbs where there are very low densities, and suddenly you have these whole new gated communities which are coming up. So the kind of urban fabric which is created due to this kind of development is completely isolated due to high density, and they are kind of gated communities. You can also imagine the kind of urban life that we are having since we are going vertical. I mean, nobody's talking about connection with the ground, or nobody's talking about when you open a window, you're actually peeping in somebody else's window. And as I've said, that they are kind of placed at the fringes. People have to commute. The commercial or the markets or the jobs are still at the city centers, and they still have to commute every day. So that is something that is really affecting the aspect of sustainability in terms of transport, and in terms of the whole model that we talk about, where you live and work model. So this type of development has often led to displacement of lower income residents who cannot afford to live in the city centers due to the rise in rents and properties. As a result, gentrification has contributed to social and economical inequalities in Mumbai. Now, this project also, they have kind of a potential to boost the economic growth, but it also doesn't address the aspect of affordability to a good context. Now, a market which needs to work on supply and demand, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. It works on the basis of need and opportunities, where the land parcel in Mumbai is really, really high. I mean, if you develop something, the development costs are very high, and ultimately it makes the houses or commercial properties that you make really unaffordable. So a lot of investments have started to happen, and you can see the article which I've given below. I mean, after so many houses also, there are still so many houses which are vacant, which are unoccupied because of this aspect of unaffordability. And it's not that there are no other initiatives which are being done. So there are projects like mass housing which are happening, But due to the developer-driven approach and due to personal interest and really, little thought about having good amenities, infrastructure, and the size of tenements that we have, household units, uh, poor planning is one of the major factors which is kind of affecting all these public projects, which can be done in a very thoughtful way. So, in order to conclude, I just want to say that the strategic planning of formal and informal sectors in the city can happen from the beginning itself, where we consider all the stratas and all the aspects of including all the people. It can happen in a sustainable way where instead of having one central CBD and then people coming there, you can actually start inclusive development by polycentric development and decentralizing things where people actually have multiple opportunities to come up with commercial, residential, and industrial kind of land uses. And I think that will also kind of give us the urban fabric or urban build form that we all urban designers imagine. So yes, thank you. That's what from my side.
Thank you very much, Suyash. That was again fascinating account of Mumbai's context and experience in what is a hugely global issue. So thanks so much. I just wanted to remind everyone that we are taking questions for speakers in the chat for the discussion round at the end. So if there's any questions that you would like to raise, please do pop them in the chat or in the Q&A function under activities. So you can access that through the triangle, the square, and the circle icon at the bottom. Thank you. So we'll move on to our third speaker, Hadi Arbabi from the University of Sheffield. And Hadi's work and interests sit at the interface of data-driven urban engineering and planning. He's been a work package leader for the Active Building Centre, where his research focused on scalable approaches to build and stock characterization for retrofit. So a nice crossover there into the previous speaker as well. Prior to this, Hadi's research involved providing new insights on the effects of spatial scale on urban economic performance and balance, and the extent to which it was influenced by urban density and mobility infrastructure across spatial scales. So I'll hand over to Hadi for his presentation, if that's okay, Hadi.
Thanks, Steve. We'll just figure out whether I'll manage to share without too much drama. Can we see something or a slide?
Yes, that's good, Hadi.
Yeah. Great. Right, and it does move. Yes, great. Right, so I will try to kind of change some of my stuff on the fly and be a bit more brief. Guilherme has already kind of touched on some of this stuff about why we kind of like densities, and Suyash has kind of alluded to problems with lack of polycentricity, mixed use planning in cities. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of advocate for bigger does more with less in context of cities, caveating it, but it potentially do more with less. But kind of look at the big picture of why we expect those behaviors from cities and how kind of knowing that mechanism behind those effects is helpful in trying to work out what you would want to do with different areas, whether it's in terms of density, connectivity, or overall land use planning. So in kind of a big picture of where we are population-wise and when we are going, we've planetarily speaking, we've had a kind of an explosion of population over the last 200 years or so, and it's not looking to be slowing down. Now, my numbers are a bit out of date at the moment. New revised UN projections for birth rates and populations how our overall urban population is slightly lower by the end of the century, but we are still looking at a large increase in our population, particularly in the urban areas over the next 7 years or so. And people take up space. And in terms of how much space that explosion of population will require, we are looking at a tripling of the built-up areas we currently have for a doubling of urban population that we expect by 2050. And the majority of these we expect to be happening in parts of Asia, Africa, and Central America. So these are places that are already populous and are going to be seeing the majority of the new cities, new mid-sized cities, and the larger growth in the already big cities. But our context, or what majority of people I'm assuming are familiar with, is kind of cities in the UK or nearby in Europe. So I'm going to keep some of my examples to this context. Now, this idea of density being beneficial both from a transport perspective or by extension in the kind of the language of today in sustainability terms and emissions probably started back in the 80s with one study looking at global cities across different continents, from North American cities to Central European ones and the Asian ones, and observing that the kind of the per capita petrol consumption in these cities dropped drastically with population city looking at it. And between kind of this kind of a transport-driven look and the kind of the work that was being done throughout the 60s by people like Jane Jacobs on how cities function from a planning aspect, or how that kind of the economy of big cities define the prosperity of the nations they belong to and themselves, resulted in kind of a 40-year-long series of observations and attempts to try to codify why we see agglomeration in cities, and why is it that we kind of expect bigger cities to be faster, richer, and or more efficient, and or if you would like it, if why a bigger city like New York is not just a sum of smaller cities to its size. It has a non-linear relationship with the cities of a smaller size or bigger than itself. So when we double our population, we expect them to be more productive than just producing twice as much economic output or GDP. Or when we double our population, we expect some of the services that we provide to become more efficient. And this is kind of the observations that accumulated all the way throughout the early 2000s in terms of various different various metrics for cities exhibited this kind of duality of some showing increasing returns to scale and some showing efficiencies with increased population. And we're kind of the splits that we observe is that the ones that have to do with interactions of people, so those, the generation of wealth or the information, those are the ones that we expect to become more productive or have increasing returns. And the ones that are infrastructure based, so that they have that relationship to the services that required to provide for that interaction and movement of people, having a kind of a less than proportional return. And this is the part that I would say I'm advocating for a bigger cities do a lot more with less, but the interaction of people kind of dominate all these aspects. So anything that happens with interaction will have these characteristics. So yes, bigger cities we expect them to have higher per capita economic output. We also expect them to have a larger per capita predominance and prevalence of STIs. It just goes hand in hand. So it's difficult to separate. If it's driven by people interacting, you get the good with the bad. But so kind of to show this interaction and the fact that it's driven by these the network of people having to interact to either produce information, economic wealth, and or their situation in the kind of where the city is placed dominates how the infrastructure is provided, we're going to have a look at kind of the examples from the UK and the local authorities, and note that these relationships change depending on where you're drawing the city. So I've got 3 panels. We're looking at transport, energy, domestic electricity, and domestic gas. Now, for the first 2, when it's just transport, energy, and electricity, we see this, what we expect. Bigger cities, higher densities, do a lot more with less. They are more efficient in terms of transport energy, and they're more efficient in terms of domestic electricity use. Gas becomes weird. We have a U-shape, and that's the part where you go, well, I need to go and look back how I defined my cities. Because the kind of the physical characteristics of the infrastructure that's being provided changes when I have rural and urban places. And it's when you factor in that physicality of those infrastructures on top of the fact that, do I expect interactions to be driven by people interacting, or do I expect interactions to be driven by the shape and physicality of the metric I'm looking at? Similarly, with transport emissions, we have plenty of evidence that it's driven by both density and population, and it has to be mostly because, yes, more people means the fact that we can describe why the emissions kind of drop with the density has more to do with having both the population but a smaller area. So what you can see on the left-hand side panel is that if I wanted very, very few transport-related emissions, I would like very small number of people, potentially in the smallest amount of area possible. As the population goes up, the emission will go up. So I'm not getting my efficiencies from the increasing number of people. I'm getting that drop in CO2 because I can effectively cram more people in smaller areas, minimizing the need for that emission. Now, if I were looking at actual, let's say, energy dissipated in my transport rather than the emissions, I will get a slightly different relationship, because the energy that's happening in the background is now only have to do with the people and the place they go. I can kind of disaggregate or disentangle the CO2 effectively repercussions of my travel from the travel itself. So there is a duality of that. Yes, density-driven encourages transport. 15-minute walk cities, 15-minute cities encourage lower emissions. But if you disconnected your emissions from your travel, you lose that argument. So you have 2 levers in influencing that, not just one. So going back to why we kind of see this, we had the kind of the argument with Suyash that we have cities because we have a list of things people want to do and their activities they want to engage in, and cities are places for these activities taking place. And we can either segregate these activities, we can have some of them mixed in different neighborhoods, or we can have most of them in a kind of a heterogeneous and low segregated mix of those activities. And what effectively is happening with this is us increasing the likelihood of people interacting with these over a lower distance. So we are getting the benefits of the number of interactions that people are having, economic output, information, wealth, while minimizing the distances over which they happen without losing that the same similar number of interactions, hence the mixed use. So in kind of the simplifying that kind of the mechanistic physical modeling behind our expectation, you can think of it as cities exist as long as the economic output they are producing is higher than the cost of people moving around generating that output. That's what's keeping people in the same place or in that in that place. And so as long as that's positive, the city exists. But this tension exists in between how much is being spent on getting people around, the congestions that kind of are introduced as the number of people increases, versus the output that we are getting. And so there's that sweet spot as this function of productivity and density, after which the city is successful, but it's now we are getting the effect of congestion. Moving people around through other people to get to the places they want is incurring more time, more energy, causing more emissions. And that's where we kind of get fractured big conurbations that kind of self-organize into smaller places in between. And what kind of, in terms of diagnosing places that are in different sides of the sweet spot, is if you're below that, so you're still walking your way up that hill in terms of economic output, it's all about connectivity. What is needed is better mixing with people, because that's what's encouraging those economic or informational wealth related outcomes. If you're a successful city and you're kind of dropping off the other side of the hill, these are hints to our big cities like London, like Paris, like New York, is you've gotten there because you already have the transport or the mobility system or the planning that's enabling that. And that's where getting back up is about kind of densifying and regrouping. So you're increasing your number of interactions without impinging or without resulting to people traveling further distances because it's a successful city that guarantees some of those outcomes or activities. And we expect cities to naturally organize around that point of optimum. And when we kind of look at different cities, and these are some of the information Guilherme already kind of touched on, that's what we see. Sorry, I'm too fast. So looking at kind of a pan-European case of all self-contained labor markets across Europe. This is including the UK. It's from the previous census. So we see those increasing returns on economic output and efficiencies in terms of infrastructure and urbanized area across all of these cities combined. And that includes the cities in the UK, the ones that are, well, we know, for those of us who are north of England, have those deficiencies in terms of economic performance and or connectivity. And the panel furthermost to the right is that sweet spot on that hill. And majority of the cities do organize around that sweet spot. And it's whether or not the city is doing well or is successful or is struggling with connectivity is effectively what's determining whether they are above or below that sweet spot. So looking more closely at that, we've got the places like London, like Madrid, like Warsaw, who are for the average of our overall urban system are the successful ones, are the ones that have made it over the hump and are probably suffering from having big big commuter areas where they would fare better if that commuter area was condensed back into the city proper. And places that are below that line, which includes a lot of the English North, will benefit from better connectivity, as Guilherme pointed out. But that's independent from where we draw the boundary. When we kind of go through this exercise and look at these cities with arbitrary boundaries, whether they're defined by density or whether they're self-contained urban markets, labor markets, or even local authorities, it's the problem with connectivity is recurring across those steps. It's not an issue of connect different cities in the north together, center to center, or connect specific parts of them. This difficulty in getting around, particularly compared to other units across this pan-European urban system, is happening across these various scales. Now, what's recurring overall is that regardless of which groups of cities we're looking at, this the increasing returns in economic output and the efficiencies we're getting in density are complementary. If you're getting larger than expected increasing returns to your economic output, we see steeper differentials and gradients in density. And when the density disappears, so does that increasing returns in economic output. So they go hand in hand. So we end up with a situation where, for the very particular case of the UK urban system, it's very easy to kind of look at the deviations we are seeing from the expected size, the kind of urbanized area of a city, and the expected size of its economy based on its population, and go, well, the difference I'm seeing is that the sparser they get, the poorer they become from my expectation. And the way back up to the left top side is densifying to shift left, and providing that better connectivity is actually what driving the connection and the economy to go towards top of the plot. Now, I'm going to kind of leave that there from the effects of density. What I would just like for a couple of minutes is that's the homework was, is it our future? I would say, I'm not sure whether we can afford not to densify depending on how our next 30 to 40 years go. So most of our conversation is happening either in mitigation or ignoring the effects of climate change. One of the works that we've recently been doing is looking at how the planet looks like under the extreme ends of our expected ranges of climate change impact. So what's happening on the line that's at the topmost of our IPCC projections, and look at across different metrics from temperature, humidity, length of the agricultural season, what's happening in different places of the planet. So that's what we've been looking at and trying to work out how many different metrics does a patch of land overshoots in terms of anomalies of what's habitable or what would allow for a production of food or economic activity. And obviously we're looking at the extreme ends. So this is a kind of a theoretical abstract exercise, but things look grim when you look at those ends and look at how many places will no longer have the capacity to some extent to easily provide for habitable areas for people, and then try to rank places where they're having the majority of their land mass impacted by a majority or a variety of different metrics. As I said, higher temperature, higher humidities, lower length of growing agricultural season, and or longer consecutive dry days or wet days. A majority of these, you wouldn't be surprised, are in Central Asia, or North Africa and Central America. These are all populous places. So as a case in point, Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo is currently 12 million, or was 12 million back in 2015, is projected to be 83 million people by 2100. It's one of the areas that, if we have not mitigated well by end of the century, will be very difficult to maintain people. This 83 million people will have to live somewhere, potentially somewhere outside their current projected area. And that means inevitable higher or potentially could mean inevitable higher density in other cities that we have. So consideration of what works best now, but how can we kind of both design and provide for sustainable infrastructure that can cope with higher densities and provide well with the for those populations is going to be the challenge over the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadi. Well, food for thought there in a number of different forms. Thank you so much. So what I want to do now is to open up the floor, so to speak, to our speakers. There's a whole series of intersections there across the three talks that I think we could begin to unpack. Everything from kind of transport through to environmental pressures, through to energy efficiencies and density being both a potential source of a solution and also a challenge going forward. So there's a range, I think, of provocations that our three speakers have unraveled there and posed for us. And so I would like to open up the remainder of the session, so the last 30 minutes or so, for a broader discussion across those different talks, and also drawing in some of the insights and perspectives from our audience. So I will move to the chat and the questions, and there's a question that came in early on from Danielle, which I'll start with, which is for Guilherme. A lot of people worried that dense cities would have a lack of green space for residents. I was wondering if you know what access to green space the more dense European cities like Lille have compared to some of the others that you mentioned. And do you think this is a problem going forward, given the perspective that Hadi raised about urban heat island and so on and so forth?
So sure. So on the first question, if I know about access to green spaces, the answer is it's no. I don't know if they differ much or not from British cities. So on the green space, I think there are two components. One is having our own green space, so a garden, a back garden, and that part, it's very unlikely that you keep it with densification. So let's call it almost like the private green space. You can mitigate that, and I think that's one of the challenges with densification with mid-rise. It's the common areas, the public common areas. That's one of the reasons why these ideas around super blocks, for example, are becoming so popular. It's the way of making the common areas as good as proxy to a private garden as possible. On the overall green areas, I really don't know the data. The impression I have from London, for example, is that it's compatible. It doesn't mean that it will happen, but I think it's quite compatible that you densify, you allow some areas to be built up and provide green spaces. But I think the key challenge for British cities is mostly on the semi-public areas, on newer buildings, how we can make them as pleasant as possible and a quasi-substitute to gardens. I've seen some developments that they seem to be doing that quite effectively, but I think there's a huge debate and ongoing process on that front.
And on that, I think there's another question that came in before the session today from Kate Needham at the Green Party, who was kind of building on that perspective that you've just outlined there. Essentially, what does densification look like from a planning strategy, if you like, from a planning agenda? Is it about demolition and demolition, I should say, and densification, i.e. rebuild, or is it something else? Can it be a retrofit strategy? And what would that retrofit strategy look like going forward? So there's been, I think, Suyash as well, you mentioned certain ideas and projects within Mumbai. And I don't know whether anybody else has any other kind of perspectives on this, but I think it's a really important question about, the equity and sustainability of kind of our decision making as well around this.
So yeah, I think as you mentioned, absolutely. I mean, any kind of retrofitting project that you are doing in an existing fabric kind of has its own challenges with respect to, infrastructure, whether you are increasing the density or you just completely demolishing the projects and building a new building or new structure. So if you see, this particular phenomenon also has been happening in Mumbai, where buildings which are older than 60, 70 years old of age, they are being demolished, and this is happening particularly in the main island city, particularly where we have old buildings, and we are kind of increasing the densities by going really up and by accommodating more people in the less footprint. But as I've mentioned, that is just going to increase the problem further and further, rather than increasing the densities on the existing fabric. I think the approach should be we kind of create different centers where we kind of have a planned development where we allow that city to grow a little organically and a little planned way also. And we plan for densities, which is happening in case of Navi Mumbai, which is like the satellite town of Mumbai. Yeah.
Thanks, Suyash. Hadi,
I was just going to plug the work of one of our researchers who's specifically looking at the structural retrofit of housing in the UK, and the fact that the old buildings that we have, mostly from a planning perspective, can be extended in height, both as a mixture of them being over-designed at the time they were over-designed and the recent changes to the planning application. So there is a lot of capacity, particularly for Sheffield. There's a part where I'm aware of what Charles Gillett, who's the researcher who's done the work, was looked at. We have a lot of between 1 to 2 story capacity on the existing residential buildings that are in Sheffield, where the additional density will be provided where the existing housing is as a retrofit of the current stock, rather than demolition of the existing and reconstruction of taller or higher density buildings. And that would be great. I think, particularly in the case of the UK, the problem beyond the technical that you run into is the issues around who owns, particularly with regards to the leasehold and freehold in the UK, is what are the incentives of a homeowner extending a building into what is effectively now apartments, flats, rather than simply using that vertical extension as extra additional floor space for their own units, as this house is now more expensive. So the challenges, I think, are mostly on the planning and policy side, rather than the technicality of structurally retrofitting housing, either on vertical extension of existing housing or the conversion of less used formerly commercial buildings into good housing.
Yeah. Guilherme, did you have anything to add to that?
Not much. So yeah, it's the planning and the policy part of it. It's the enormous challenge. We do know that the UK housing stock it's probably the oldest one and the most inefficient one in Western Europe. A lot so far, I think, for example, in cities like Manchester, a lot of the densification has been done in brownfield, especially because brownfield sometimes requires that even to become viable as a project. I think we are not close in the plan yet on the planning side. What's the best way of dealing with densification of, for example, very well connected areas that has something there? And I think we are not there yet in terms of what should be our strategy.
Okay, and so I mean, I think planning is one side of that discussion in some ways, and there's a question that was submitted previously by Kelly Graham from Newcastle City Council, where the provocation then was, can we ask for car-free development, because there are issues with brownfield sites around things like viability, attraction. How do we expect developers, or how do we encourage and incentivize developers to take risks? And there's a lot of debate around this at the minute around housing, for instance. We've seen a lot of it in the press of late. So we are in that model of developer-led building. So I mean, the planning system is one side of that, but it's only it's only one side of it, and there's still that huge decision-making framework that needs to come into play around kind of the developer kind of contribution as well. So are we in that space where we can now start to incentivize developers to think differently? Tumbleweed. I don't know, Suyash, whether you've got a different perspective coming, a different model potentially.
I think it's very unfortunate that the entire development that has been happening in India, predominantly in the case of Mumbai, is completely builder driven. Where, uh, I mean, even though there are building bylaws, building norms, authorities who are kind of making sure that the building should happen in a particular way, but the economic market has been completely changed and modified in such a way that only one sector of a society is kind of completely minting money, and without even giving habitable spaces that we really need. So that is something that is happening. I mean, there are incentives which are given. Unfortunately, I'll just give you an example. I mean, having balconies in your spaces, having balconies in your house, it was completely given as a free earlier, but builders started to, there's always a way where a developer will always try to tweak the bylaws and then use it for his own interest. So I don't think that has not worked here, and we are unfortunately seeing a completely builder-driven development, which is kind of very evident, which is seen.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question in our Q&A list, which is from Will Mickelson. For Hadi and anyone else with a perspective on this, will densification of cities inevitably increase the inequality of social outcomes? And what might implications of this inequality be? And are there any interesting examples of how this is being tackled? So how potential inequalities are being tackled?
I'll have a stab at it. I think that depends to some extent on the context of the urban system that we're discussing, because that matters on how the broader system provides for those for the services or what we expect them to. In developed places like the UK, we are past the kind of a development mark. So bigger statistical samples will always better demonstrate the higher heterogeneity you would expect. So you get that effect of the inequality because of that. But the baseline would have increased. It's the overall system where the service is provided and the heterogeneity of that, or the inequality of that, goes up as a kind of an average of that whole system. So it's still that bigger places by the default of being larger, providing you with a larger sample case, will demonstrate that inequality, but that's relative to their own urban system. The inequality that you will see in the higher city in the UK may be much lower, while still amplified in the system, than the inequality that you would see in the largest city of a urban system in a more developing country. Now, that's also the case that the larger inequality is different than the kind of the lack of those services. The smaller cities will have less of an inequality, but that's because the overall average provision of those services is uniformly lower. So it's kind of that balance where bigger cities are not very good at uniformly increasing services. So they get bigger and then they start addressing inequalities. So it's just, I don't have a yes or no or definitive answer.
Thanks, Hadi. Suyash, Guilherme, did you have anything to add to that?
I think I agree with what Hadi said. I mean, it's very difficult to answer this question in a simple yes or no. But yeah, I mean, it's inevitable. It's very evident, and once you kind of achieve that developed density, I think that's the time where we start to address these questions, as you rightly said. So it is bound to happen.
And that again moves us into another interesting perspective on the way in which urban growth and urban change is going to be managed going forward. So again, a question that's come in from Alison Teal: will people be forcibly, I should say, moved from their homes to the periphery of cities in newly developing and densely populated densely central areas? Given that not everyone wants to live in compact contexts. And it then draws in another question, which is, that is being posed, which is how do you balance the needs and wants of different communities with different perspectives on living in densely populated areas? COVID's been a prime example of some of the potential challenges that creates. So climate change being another one. Are we in a situation, as Will has asked in another question, where climate change is potentially, densification is going to potentially intensify some climate risks within certain parts of the world? So there are, I think, a host of kind of questions there that would be useful to talk about around this kind of social equity, environmental justice element of densification as well. I know, Suyash, you mentioned some of the work that's going on in Mumbai around kind of climate mitigation and everything else. So yeah, so is there a potentially a question here about how we manage that trade-off between the politics as well as the social sustainability and the inevitable question about net zero and so on going forward across the different contexts that you guys have talked about?
I'll try not to directly answer the whether people should be forcibly made to move. What I would...
Sorry, Hadi, I think probably not forcefully, but will that kind of be a feature?
What I would say is that with a lot of kind of issues we're having with cities, it's not that we don't know kind of what the technical aspect of how to do certain things. A lot of them come down to this: is the community ready to take some of the measures that's required for some of the outcomes they are asking for? I'll demonstrate this in the context of particularly climate change and the fact that UK has a lot of coastal or water adjacent cities, is that we determine that flooding is a risk in cities in the UK. And then we proceed to deal with that by designing and redeploying and repairing flood defenses. From a long-term answer, you could look at the same situation and go, well, move the housing out of the floodplain. We know where exactly it's going to flood. It's not like we're not spending money on it. Those flood defenses and flood barriers are extremely expensive pieces of infrastructure. They are also carbon intensive. But it's a kind of a community decision making, whether people can. Part of it is, could communities afford to move out? Could the state kind of get to grips with a debate that it won't really cost a lot more in terms of the upfront investment to provide that housing somewhere else relative to continually reinforce flooding defenses for the same area where we know it's going to flood? And a lot of these are no longer kind of technical engineering or technical planning or transport conversations. They are, to some extent, political issues of community organization, community activity, and action. Does the community really want to do something about the climate change? Because there are costs. The outcomes we want, there are things that will have to be adjusted. Some of it would be personal, some of it would be a larger or louder request for systemic changes somewhere else that would enable action for those particular instances. I hope that was as vague as I was intending it.
So is there a risk then, Hadi? So Maria's just posed the question, is there a risk of passing responsibility onto individuals to deal with climate change? It's I imagine.
No, not mitigating it, but if we all agree that the state needs to do something about it, it's demanding it louder from the state. Because that's the only thing currently within the whole point is that we can't individually move those housing units out of the flood zone, but we can write to our local councillors and MPs when they introduce new housing in the flood zone with the additional flood barrier, where technically they are addressing the risks from climate change, but you could ask the question of why is it being provided in that manner? It's more of the more engagement at the individual level, not individual action the same way some would say change your diet or shop differently. I didn't mean that.
Thank you. Any further responses from Willem or Suyash? No. Okay, so we've had I think a really interesting question from Tani Islam, who's asked, is virtual connectivity taken into consideration for city planning? I imagine around questions of densification. And in some ways, that's an interesting one because the virtual still relies on a physical network. So there is still crossover into the debate here. And I think it raises some really interesting questions about some of those relationships that you were talking about, Hadi, albeit from a different perspective. So I don't know whether anybody has any views on the future of the city under increasing digitalization, and what implications that might have for debates around densification.
I'll go. I think, yes, it is happening. So, first of all, it has not been happening till now, but COVID, I think, has taught everyone that work from home can work. So, in Indian context, I think a lot of people have started to kind of, outsource a lot of work where people can actually work from home. And it is working excellently because they are incentivizing people to sit home and then work, because it reduces a lot of overheads and reduces a lot of running costs. So that's, I think, an excellent way to reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the emissions, where people have to commute to spaces and they are no longer requiring any particular space as from where they can operate. So these are the things, I think, which are being practiced in most of the metropolitan cities in India, which Bangalore, Pune, Mumbai being the IT hub. IT is one of the classic example where they have started shifting to work from home basis almost more than 30-40%, and we can imagine. So yes, till now it has not been considering, but I'm sure this will become a thing in the next planning master plans that we will prepare in the future.
Right, that's great, thank you. Hadi, Willem, I don't know whether you had any views on that from a UK point of view as well, or a European perspective, given what you presented.
So on the virtual connectivity one, so going a little bit back to COVID and working from home. So we've seen that a vast percentage of the workforce can, and from the recovery, it's willing to work from home. One thing that I've been noticing when looking at different cities around the world is that return to the office is not very symmetric, which kind of suggests there's something behind the decision that is not only the work. So US recovery has been much lower, and we know that in US commutes are much longer. I know there are other factors. Continental Europe, the return to the city or to the office has been quicker. So I think we may reach an equilibrium that the preferences of going to the city often really depends on the build-up form, and I think the denser ones will be closer to have those interactions. In other places, that working from home and the virtual connectivity will play a larger role. I think there will be a little bit of a reshuffling of what we do in the cities. But what the literature says, that even if we like and are very effective working from home, we miss other people. So we may not go to the office, but we go to the city or other places doing elsewhere. So I think it's meeting the new balance. And I think the sprawlier you are, probably the further away you are from the new equilibrium, but I'm not entirely sure how it will look.
Yeah, thank you. And a couple of last points before we draw to a close. Zaiz asked, what's the potential influence of densification on the lifespan of infrastructure, like roads and railways? Will it increase the cost of maintenance or the frequency of maintenance and other forms of management, if you like, of that infrastructure in ways that were maybe at the moment are a bit unanticipated or are less familiar to us? So I'll open that up to our three speakers.
I wouldn't have an evidence for this. I can kind of try to guess and extrapolate based on what we would expect in terms of the efficiency or returns to scale on an issue like this. Would be the frequency of the repairs would increase mostly because the frequency of use would. So if it's a piece of a structure that suffers wear, it will do so more frequently. Whether it would be more costly comes down to whether the cost kind of scales with the fact that if I'm taking care of, let's say, a pothole that's further away from the city, that increases the cost more than filling the pothole itself, in which case the frequency is going up, but the cost not necessarily. But that's not something I think we have complete information on.
Okay. Thanks, Hadi.
I mean, this is just one example, but Crossrail kind of show that yes, it does increase. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It doesn't mean it's not beneficial. But like, if it stands congested and successful, to the extreme, you need to do another line, which is Crossrail. In other cases, you just need to buy more trains and things like that. But I think Crossrail is just a good example of it, and therefore you should do it probably.
Okay. Excellent. And I'm going to finish off with one last question, which is, is urban densification and the future of our cities? Yes or no? Hadi says yes. Guilherme says yes.
Yes. but in a little tweaked way, because the Indian context which I just spoke about is totally different. I mean, we cannot imagine densifying our cities. We just crossed China recently, so we are the most. I mean, in the population chart, we are the number one. So the current scenario that we are tackling is absolutely different, where we need to kind of create and de-densify our cities a little more to have a little life in our cities.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. Well, that leaves me with just to thank our speakers for attending today and for presenting their thoughts. So Hadi, who's had to leave, Guilherme and Suyash for what I think were really insightful, really diverse, and also really complementary perspectives on that question of densification and the future of our urban form and so on. So I just again like to say thank you to everyone for attending. thank you for supporting the Grantham Festival of Debate. And I hope, like me, you've found this both to be provocative and also useful in the work you're doing and in your kind of thinking around the future of cities under a range of challenges as we move forward. So thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you at some other events.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.